Oh, and welcome. It's good to be here chatting. And yeah, I'm going to be covering a lot of territory in these, my two books basically go from the 1660s all the way up until just after 1885 and cover a wide variety of topics, with tendrils of history that stretch back into Europe and have to do with the English and the French and the Americans and the Chinese and other global events and the technological developments. So, there's a lot going on. I'm going to break the presentation down into two components, each one roughly correlating to one of my books. The first one is going to be on the fur trade and the Hudson's Bay Company. And the next one will be, as Lynn mentioned, on the CPR. And each of those topics is very large. So I'm going to be, trying to give an overview and trying to make it as interesting as I possibly can. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end because I know that there's no way of covering in depth all the ins and outs of those enormous Canadian stories during, one 20-minute period roughly for each one. So without too much more wasted time, I will begin. The first idea of the fur trade in Canada, I mean, that is our main massive story that set the foundations for the entire country. And it all began mostly out of the antics of two French, yeah, they were born in France, and then they were living in New France along the St. Lawrence River area, which of course at the time had hardly any people, that had a few thousand people. In the mid 17th century, sorry, there was, the famous Groseilliers and Radisson. And they were involved in the fur trade, like a lot of the economy of that region was at the time. The French government wanted to promote farming and settlement, but the economics dictated that fur trading or any kind of interaction with multiple indigenous cultures around there, was a lot more profitable and a lot more interesting for some of the people. And so these fellows were engaged in the trade, which was always being tamped down and restricted by the governors of the region. And they always wanted to sneak away, like many other people, and engage in this illicit activity, which was highly profitable because the fur of the beaver at the time, especially in Europe, I'll just explain why the fur trade was valuable. Essentially, it could be made into a felt, and the felt could be made into valuable clothing items in an era when there were no other synthetic fibers. So, for making any form of hats that were waterproof, which was the only option people had for weather, and that was the main reason that people were interested in fur, was for clothing, and specifically the fact that you could make it into felt, which could be molded, and that really drove the economy for, well, hundreds of years in this, part of the world that we call Canada now and over into Europe. So it's actually fascinating that the fur of an animal that's used in fashion was the main economic driver for, centuries. So anyway, that's why fur was so valuable. And the further north you went, the better the quality of the fur, because the winters were colder and the pelts of the beavers were thicker and more rich and more luxurious. And the interesting thing about this early trade is that the best furs were actually the furs that were worn by people for a year. So, I was referring to it, amusingly, as the used clothing trade, because when they had no process to eliminate the outer fur tendrils and to get to the soft, plush inner ones of the beaver's pelt, the best way to have that was for someone to wear it for a year. So many of the indigenous people thought this was a great plan right from the very beginning. Yeah, spring is coming, and they're about to discard these heavy garments that are no longer use anymore because they've worn them all winter long. They're about to get rid of it because they're not going to carry it around with them forever. It would probably not survive very well. And so for them, it was a no-brainer. I mean, you get these extremely valuable items. Anything made of metal was what was missing from the basket of trade goods in that region. And Yeah, you could trade your old clothing and get a priceless piece of metal. So multiple sources always comment on that, how astonished people were that they could um, gain such valuable items to them for discarding something that was essentially valueless, that was worth a fortune once it got to Europe. Now, of course, later that changed, and they did develop a process by which the outer furs could be eliminated mechanically, but that took a while. And so, to return to Radisson and Groseilliers, they went on multiple adventures, and they were always having their aspirations restricted by the governor. And there's one particular expedition that completely transformed, well, the history of Canada. They went on a long expedition, an exploratory expedition. They fled the confines of the colonies, and for several years they just kept going further and further west, and they ended up far west of Lake Superior on the Upper Missouri River area, where they were visiting in the Mantan villages out there. And along this journey, they were just paying attention to the complexity of the pre-existing trade networks in that part of the world, which there's varied. I mean, there were items for sale in the Mandan villages from the far north. There was, there were furs being sold. There were different meats and foods, and the claws of different birds, and different stones, and different jewelry. At these trade fairs that were there was a great deal of stuff all converging on this area, and they were amazed at the variety of it, and their brains were always commercially oriented. They were always scheming of a way to gain wealth for themselves. They were trying to think, well, how could we tap into this pre-existing trade network without years of travel on from New France area all the way out to the western Lake Superior. So on their way back from this journey, they decided to make a detour to the north. They had a very rudimentary knowledge of geography. Well, of course, everyone's knowledge of geography at that time was rudimentary, but they had heard of the fact that there used to be British ships going into, Hudson, an area that we called Hudson's Bay, and there was some famous voyages up there, and they just kind of had this idea, like, what if that bay was up there? And so they did take a detour, and they went pretty far north, and they encountered the southern coast of James Bay. Of course, they didn't know exactly where they were or anything, but they observed this large body of salt water, and they correctly surmised that must be some part of this inland sea that the British had always been exploring. And so they took this knowledge with them, and they went back to New France, and they had with them, by the time they converged back there, they had collected up huge numbers of furs, and they had a whole bunch of other people helping them carry this vast wealth of fur knowledge into the colony. And the governor was a bit corrupt, which many of those politicians at that time were extremely corrupt. And he seized most of their furs, claiming that they didn't have a proper license for having done what they had done. They wanted to have a very strict control of the economy. Like, I jokingly refer to it as supply management for furs. And so a lot of their wealth was stolen, and they were very irritated by this, as you can imagine. And so in the coming months, they set off, and they went down to New England. They traveled down there, and they tried to peddle this idea to New England, because they knew that there was no way that this idea was going to fly in the colonies along the St. Lawrence, that to use a British waterway to gain access to the wealth of the far west, which was more or less economically inaccessible to the St. Lawrence because of the vast geography and the complexity of it. So they tried to peddle this the idea in New England, and they were rebuffed because the financing wasn't available, and those weren't especially prosperous areas at the time either. But they did manage to meet someone who sent them back to London in 1665 to meet some royal people within the British English government who were going to, possibly be investors in a scheme, or at least wanted to hear the idea out further. And so they arrive in England in 1665. That's, of course, plague year. A quarter of the population of London died during that year of bubonic plague. We're talking 100,000 of people were dying. And so as they sailed up the the river, the city was a disaster. There was smoke and burning and dead bodies, and there was nowhere to land. And the King Charles II and the English court had all fled inland to Oxford, so they continued sailing up the river, and they did meet with the English court eventually during this chaotic time, and they managed to, well, peddle the idea that they should involve the English crown in this enterprise. And they did manage to get investors, and they did manage to get English backing, and it resulted in the famous charter of 1670, the Hudson's Bay Company Charter, which gave them a monopoly of trade in all the areas that were drainage basin to Hudson's Bay. And well, much has been made about how grand and magnificent this monopoly was, but at the time it just meant protection from domestic trade from other English people. So anyway, with this royal backing and this royal charter and this monopoly, this new company, which did employ Groseilliers and Radisson in various capacities to help get it started over the years, managed to set up a string of rudimentary trading outposts along the rim of Hudson's Bay. And, of course, how do you populate an area like that that's so far from England at the time? I always like to harken back to the idea of technology and how technology is what drives politics, not necessarily the other way around. And in this era, of course, there was no communications, there was no accurate maps, there was no way to properly and accurately navigate exactly where you were without a painstaking effort of observation of the stars and many days of work. And sailing technology was wooden ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean, somehow making their way through Hudson Strait, a ice and choked, disastrous waterway, and across this, iceberg infested Hudson's Bay in the subarctic in order to get to the chilly rim of the bay. I mean, this voyage could take 2 months, and it was horrible. And the scurvy and other diseases could have been on those ships, and many people died. It was not an easy trip, extremely expensive because a small number of people could fit on those ships in the first place. So when the workers signed on to work for the company in any of these remote outposts, it was usually for a 7-year contract. And many of them renewed their contract for more than 7 years, because part of the idea of engaging in this fur trade was that you integrated yourself with the indigenous societies. And at first, that generally was the Cree peoples who lived in those areas where the Hudson's Bay was operating. And so right from the very beginning, they married into those societies. Diplomatic marriages both ways provided access, and unique communities, sort of multicultural, multi-genetic communities, arose around the Hudson's Bay Company outposts. So that was one of the things I found interesting when I was researching the book, was this, the idea to which the Hudson's Bay Company, at least its domestic operations here, were fully integrated into those local societies. And the children of those initial unions became the employees of the company right from the very beginning. We're talking the 1670s here. So that essentially is how it operated. And the furs themselves were being brought in along riverways by local indigenous people. The company itself did not venture inland until almost 100 years after it had been operating there. I mean, many people don't realize this. They imagine this mighty tectonic commercial entity controlling all the continent and oppressing everyone. No, at the very beginning, they just sat there in their forts and had these little villages. And the first were brought in by a series of indigenous trading captains, some of whom were quite famous, like Matanabi and Atikashish and, Isenasu. Some of these people appear in the records as bringing like hundreds of large canoe loads worth of furs every year. And there was elaborate ceremonies on how the trade and the exchange was going to happen. And so, many people don't realize that the inland commerce, or the retail level of the commerce, was entirely controlled by indigenous trading captains who used the Hudson's Bay Company posts as wholesale distribution centers. And, this went on for a long, long, long time. That's how trade was conducted. And let me see. Sometimes we'll keep talking on a subject that interests me for too long and lose track of the time. Oh yeah, see, I've wasted a bunch of time. These trading captains somehow get overlooked in history a little bit. And and some of their actions and activities get appended onto other European explorers such as Samuel Hearne or Anthony Henday. And I pick both of those examples because they are heralded as great explorers, and yet, certainly they're brave and they're interesting people, and they kept some unusual journals of their activities. But neither of them was I mean, they were tagging on the commercial tours of other people. Like in the case of Anthony Henday, who made his famous trip inland in the 1750s, all the way within sight of the Rocky Mountains, and provided the first inland glimpse that the company ever even had, because no one from the company had ever left the coast before that. He was actually just tagging along on the regular commercial circuit of Atikashush, one of the famous Cree trading captain, who had a circuit where he would leave the coast on Hudson's Bay, travel on various river systems, cross the prairies, all the way out to within sight of the Rocky Mountains, loop up, go back along the North Saskatchewan River, through where Edmonton is now, and come back in a multi-year loop where people would meet him along the shores of the river at pre-arranged locations to conduct commerce with him, and he would do the trade, collect the furs up, whatever business arrangements they had, could be multiple and varied. And he was the one who then transported all of these furs that he'd spent 2 years collecting to the Hudson's Bay Company outposts. So Anthony Henday just went on the journey with Atikashush. So really, it should be called Atikashush's journey, since it wasn't going into new territory. It was new for Henday, and the knowledge that he brought back was, excuse me, new to the company, but it was just a standard trade route for someone else, and he brought them along more as like a tourist. And that's very interesting, and that's an interesting, a really fascinating story, how they, were actually seeing buffaloes for the first time and hunting some of them on the plains and whatnot. And there was another famous expedition which had to do with Samuel Hearne. Everyone's heard of Samuel Hearne and his multiple expeditions to the west and north of Hudson's Bay, and the observation of the famous battle at Bloody Falls up in the Arctic, where the Inuit and the Chippewyans were battling each other. He was also brought along on his journeys by his companion named Matt Nabby, who was a famous trading captain who launched the inland trade further to the north. And these people spent years together and had a great friendship and many great adventures along their route. But their names have to be considered together. It's no longer, I think, accurate to talk about either Anthony Henday or Samuel Hearne without mentioning the people that they traveled with and who actually led them around on their journeys. And so, yeah, this situation with the company, where they existed along the coast and didn't venture inland almost at all, except for a couple little, exploratory expeditions, persisted until the late 1770s. And the company would have preferred to just go on like that forever. I mean, for them, it was reasonably profitable. The people had their little villages, their customs, and they were married into the societies, and a whole bunch of the Cree were mostly living around the posts, and it was stable and it was reasonably profitable. And the financiers in England would have preferred that went on forever. But around this time, two things happened. One was there was some competition from French traders who were coming from the St. Lawrence and slowly making their way inland past all the Lake Superior, and they were coming up into this area, and they were providing some competition, although they didn't have access to the big ships to transport these goods, and they spent a lot of time traveling. They were very dynamic, and they were moving into areas, and they were taking off some of the best furs and taking away. So this competition was starting to cut into their profit a little bit. But the main thing was that there was a huge epidemic of smallpox that came up from Mexico at that time, and it swarmed across the prairies because of with horses, which were also around at that time, a newly introduced animal that mostly existed in the late 17th centuries in those areas. It didn't exist before that, but because of the horses, people could travel faster than before, and the disease spread rapidly from community to community, and it spread up the eastern coast, not the coast, the eastern range of the Rocky Mountains. It was completely devastating, all up the inland part of the continent, and then it spread eastward towards Hudson's Bay, in the 1780 time period, And it was just a horrifying situation. It killed almost up to 80% in some cases of the populations in certain regions. And it was an unexplainable illness that most people had not seen before. And it was unexplainable because one valley would be almost untouched by it, and the next valley would see their communities almost completely wiped out and gone. And it left a lot of disabled people and injured people, and people would go blind or paralyzed. And it was just a horrifying situation. It so depopulated the commercial regions and destabilized those regions that the fur trade was dying off because there wasn't enough people being and a lot enough organization to keep up the will keep up the network of hunting and trapping and all the effort that was spent to transport these. And so in order to stay in business, the company decided it was going to venture inland. And that's in the 1790s and 1780s when we start to see the founding of some of its more famous outposts, like, Fort Edmonton on the river there, I think was 1795, give or take. Someone will correct me, I'm sure, since I probably remembered the date a little bit wrong. But yeah, so it was around this time that the company started to venture inland and establish its, famous network of little trading posts on all the rivers spanning out across the entire continent and manning it with people. And this is how the Cree culture also spread across the continent, because the Cree was mostly around that area of Hudson's Bay, the south and west zones of Hudson's Bay. But they spread along with the Hudson's Bay Company into, well, I mean, the Cree was a language that was spoken on the Pacific coast in the mid 19th century by large numbers of people, because the company officers and many of the company's people were all married into those Cree societies. And so as they expanded, the culture of the Cree culture and the Cree language also expanded. And that's where you find Cree, well, in Alberta. I mean, you can find Cree used to be down in Washington State and Oregon State in the United States, everywhere. Anyway, that's just an interesting aside. And then 1056. See, I'm getting distracted. There's the story is so massive that I'm just going to go brush through a few little other aspects of it here on the Hudson's Bay Company. We have one of these famous people from Montreal. Oh, yeah. So okay, go back one little bit. As the company was expanding and its networks throughout, the rise of the Northwest Company out of Montreal was also happening concurrently. And these traders started to develop a system where they would leave Montreal in giant transport canoes, head down the various rivers like the Ottawa River, get to Lake Superior, cross all the way to the far end of Lake Superior, where they would have a giant depot at Fort William, and then fan out into the continent from there. It was a network that would take many years. And yes, it required a lot of manpower and it was somewhat inefficient, but it was very fast and very nimble. And after the English had conquered New France, they kind of, the Hudson's Bay Company thought, okay, this is great. The French traders are going to disappear now. And of course, what proved to be the opposite was that then you had a whole influx of loyalists and Scottish people moving into the Montreal region who weren't French and weren't, immigration to that area was no longer restricted to French Catholics. And you had a massive economic and cultural change in that whole region. And the entrepreneurial spirit of the Scottish people was blended with the pre-existing labor knowledge and knowledge of the interior of some of the French traders who'd been disrupted during the 7 Years' War, and combine that with access to capital from London, England, and you had this new business, the Northwest Company that I was just describing. That's why it rose so fast. And by the 1790s, it was expanding and out-competing the Hudson's Bay Company in a great many of these territories. The balance of their trade goods was a little bit different, and their techniques were very different. One was very stead and cultural, intertwined with the native societies, and sought to integrate itself permanently and solidly. And the Northwest Company was more like rapid fire canoe transportation, zipping between community and community, always on the move, very lightning quick, and return with their goods. And the Northwest Company gave rise to some famous explorers that we all know, like Alexander Mackenzie, who wanted to push the boundaries of geographic knowledge, because it was the Northwest Company that was always trying to push new markets. That's how they were going to be more profitable, because the field partners shared in the profits they generated. So it was a very different business model. They weren't employees; they were, they shared in the profits. And so, if Alexander Mackenzie or any of these other people opened up a new region to trade, they stood to become enormously wealthy, and some of them did become extremely wealthy. And all that wealth was flowing back to Montreal, and why you had the famous clubs in Montreal, like the Beaver Club, known for its crazy drunken antics, and the amount of money that was just spent and that was flooding into the city from this trade was just staggering. A lot of fortunes were made during this time. And so yeah, there's Alexander Mackenzie, who went up, of course, what's called the Mackenzie River now to the Arctic, and that proved to be a bust. There's not a lot of fur trading up there, but he didn't give up, and he eventually made his way to the Pacific Ocean along the part of the Fraser River and the Bella Coola River systems, and he was, he's heralded as an explorer, but I don't know how much he really did exploring. He was more that he met indigenous peoples from the coast there who were engaged in their regular inland trade of a fish called the ulican, the candlefish, a very oily fish which had extreme uses. And he met these people, and they said, "Well, we're on our journey back to the coast. Why don't you come with us?" And so they took him with them for large sections of this journey, and he ended up on the coast and scrawled his famous note on the rock out there by Bella Coola in British Columbia, and noticed that there was an indigenous village there with a couple thousand people living in it. And he fled back west after that. And so that opened up new trades far, far to the west. And of course, Mackenzie himself became extremely, extremely wealthy, and was living in both Montreal and Scotland, and heralded as a famous person. He wrote a book about his expedition, and it was published in 1803. And the American President Jefferson read that book, and that's why he sent out the Lewis and Clark expedition to see if they could get to the Pacific too, because they can't have who are these people claiming to be representatives of the British Empire getting out to the Pacific on our continent? And that was the idea at the time, right? And so, that set in motion some of the political developments, and that involved a competition between the United States and Britain over that part of the territory. And the Hudson's Bay Company at this time was extending its own trade networks further west too, and competing with the Northwest Company. So it was a very dynamic period of time. And eventually the competition between these two companies became so cutthroat and violent that it literally was warfare. They were ambushing each other's expeditions along the river, shooting each other, killing each other, burning each other's outposts down, destroying each other's commercial networks as much as possible. It was so dysfunctional and violent that it was threatening, the British government felt that it was threatening the stability of Britain's claim on northern North America, and that the Americans were going to come in and take advantage of that. And so they forcibly amalgamated both companies in 1821, just to prevent them from battling each other. And it changed their monopoly status. So no longer was the monopoly granted to this new Hudson's Bay Company, which is what they called it. So they got rid of the Northwest Company name completely. They called it the Hudson's Bay Company, and its monopoly was extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which at the time, it's protection against domestic competitors, but it also had a more dynastic attitude at this time, where the British government wanted them to be pursuing activities that would solidify Britain's claim to the continent in preference to the Americans' claim to the continent. And of course, some of the most famous things that happened in the company's history during this time were in this Pacific region, which was a whole region that was called Old Oregon. In one case, they sent out an expedition from I think his name was Ogden, and to go and hunt and kill all of the beavers in their areas in the zone just to the western range of the first range of mountains, and wipe them all out, exterminate them, so that American trappers coming west would come across a beaver-free dead zone and it wouldn't be economically viable for them to continue further. So, this is vicious, cutthroat behavior. And you also have Dr. John McLaughlin, the famous McLaughlin, who was also from, somewhere between Montreal and Trois-Rivières. He was just sort of a Scottish physician, well, a family of lawyers, but he became a physician and ended up founding, what's called Fort Vancouver, not the city of Vancouver, but Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River, which was the Hudson's Bay Company's hugest outpost. And he established a community there. When the American prospectors, people on the Oregon Trail were coming out, he was providing them with a home, and a little community developed around this. And of course, that provided the genesis for that entire region becoming American, because it was all American citizens. And the Hudson's Bay Company at that time had been frowning upon any kind of settlement because it was disruptive to the fur trade. And eventually all these settlers decided they were going to vote. In 1836, they left and joined the United States as new states. And the Hudson's Bay Company had a number of years and it was kicked out. And it moved its operations up to a new fort that they founded called Fort Victoria on Vancouver Island. And that's the toehold that the company had in British Columbia with its famous fort at Fort Victoria. And that was who later became Governor Douglas. James Douglas was the person who was set up to do that. A different, a Scottish, I guess you would call it Mulatu. I don't know if that word is used very much anymore, but he was half black and half Scottish, and sent to Scottish for schooling, and then was a wild person and set out for the Hudson's Bay Company post. And he married a Cree woman and had his children. And he was the founder of Fort Victoria. And he later became the governor of the colony of Victoria several years later, when gold was discovered and the miners swarmed in there. So you can see that the tendrils of history that are involved here are just staggering and enormous, and cross empires and cross cultures and cross the whole continent. And there's so many fascinating stories. It's basically impossible for me to even list them all, which I guess that's why the book ends up being over 400 pages of adventure. Yeah. And there was other famous characters like David Thompson. I mean, we had been talking about Lynn and I were discussing David Thompson before we started here. I mean, we could hardly get started on his story. I mean, from London, a poor youth who eventually learned mathematics and surveying and was sent up and worked for the Hudson's Bay Company and then joined the Northwest Company. And, he's famous for discovering the Columbia River. Yeah, the Columbia River. I mean, there's so many adventures on that where he discovered the famous pass over the Rocky Mountain. Well, first Howes Pass, which I've hiked. You can backpack that trip. It crosses, to the west of Red Deer. You follow the Red Deer River in, and it goes over the Saskatchewan River, and then down into British Columbia. A beautiful place for a pass, but the Piegan didn't like intrusions into their territory by who they perceived as invaders. And so they shut that down militarily and promised to murder or kill anyone who used that pass. So that's when Thompson went up further north and found this famous Athabasca Pass, which maybe many people have heard of. It existed as the main transportation, the land link in a waterway transportation system that could get you from Montreal to the Pacific Ocean. And this was a 50-kilometer portage, which I've also done as a backpacking trip. That's just staggering and incredible. The ghosts that lurk up there at the very pass, there's a little body of water, a small lake, and it's called the Committee's Punch Bowl. And for generations, people would always toast each other with some scotch at the top, which of course my friends and I did as well when we were there. So yeah, you head down to BC and you intersect with the Columbia River after this 50-kilometer hike. And so they had huge groups of people with pack trains of horses going up and over the pass, coming back and forth, connecting to the water systems on either end. Because once you're in the Columbia River, you can float basically all the way to the Pacific Ocean if you take a bunch of time to do it. So yeah, there's the story of discovery of Athabasca Pass by David Thompson is incredible too, and Well, I'll sum up the Hudson's Bay Company quickly here and move on to the next story. After 1821, a person named George Simpson was put in charge of the amalgamated companies. And Simpson set about, uh, banging some order into the disparity that was existing at that time and bringing back some stability to the land and removing some of the violence. Um, Now, of course, Simpson was a bit of a nasty character. I would tend to use the word asshole or psychopath or some combination of both. I mean, he was everything. He was hated by pretty much everyone. Now, he is from London, and he had his early beginning in the sugar trade and the slave trading industry. And these are some of the unsavory attitudes that he brought with him when he took over the Hudson's Bay Company. He was very racist and very misogynist. Um, and he began to shift 150 years of corporate culture, which was a very open, dynamic. Um, well, I mean, look, the company was completely married into all of these societies, indigenous societies, and all the languages and the cultural knowledge is what allowed it to thrive as an entity. Um, Simpson wanted to eliminate all that, and he stopped not promoting the mixed heritage children of his officers within the ranks of the company or paying them less money, and he started sneering on them, and he started frowning upon people having in their indigenous wives. Of course, he famously had multiple mistresses and children with women who he would discard afterwards, and he referred to them as his little bits of brown, and he was just overall a repulsive character. But he was in charge of the company for several decades. And so by the 1830s and the 1840s and the 1850s, of course, the culture of the company changed. It became much more controlling, much more abusive towards the employees, much more abusive and controlling towards all of the indigenous people, where he would do things like arbitrarily shut down an outpost in an area because he wanted to give the beavers time to recuperate. But of course, that caused economic devastation. But he didn't care about things like that. He said, "Oh, what the hell? Let him starve to death." Was sort of his attitude, and we'll open up that area to our traders afterwards. And so, all around, a very nasty person. And that's, I think, some of the negative attitudes towards the company stem from his period in charge of it. But I always like to point out the company existed for 200 years as a monopoly. 200 years is a long time. There is nothing that exists for 200 years that doesn't have multiple phases and multiple differences in how it operated and how it integrated itself with economies and how it treated people depending on who was in charge or what the politics were at the time. And the company is no exception. And the Simpson area, it's a very dark era from one point of view when you're reading about it. And I didn't like writing about it all, but I felt it has to be out there. I mean, he's a foul individual and he caused a lot of damage. But on the other hand, he also caused he made huge, enormous, staggering sums of money for the investors. And a lot of that money was all being flooded into Montreal at the time, and eventually to London, England as well. Simpson was based out of Montreal, where he had his enormous mansions near the rapid there, Lachine zone. And yeah, so, it's one of these conflicted things. There's a good side to it and a bad side to it. And you have to be able to discuss and appreciate both aspects of this story. So anyway, the company eventually lost its monopoly around the time that Canada was becoming a country. This idea that you can have, a trading company become the only form of government in a massive region, which is essentially what it had become, was even that time becoming anachronistic. And so eventually, by the time of Canada's Confederation, the company was, shuffled aside. Fur was finally being displaced as a fashion item. The top end of fashion had shifted towards silk from China. So, the top hats were no longer being made of beaver; they were being made of silk, and women's shawls or certain other, very fashionable items or items that could protect you from the rain or anything like that were being displaced, and the value of furs was declining precipitously. Not that the company couldn't operate profitably, but it was no longer the source of extreme wealth, which it had been, which, a lot of that wealth is what fueled the economic development of Montreal. And of course, a lot of that money all flooded back to England. I like to say all the money ended up in England and to a lesser extent in Montreal in the later 19th century, mid 19th century and on. But all the drama happened in North America. And so that's why my story mostly focuses on the drama. I mean, there could be a different academic look at the Hudson's Bay Company that traced nothing other than its financial flows into England and went and looked at which families got rich and where did this money go? Did it fuel wars with France, which it probably did? How did it involve in politics? That would be one that wouldn't be anywhere near as interesting as what happened in our part of the world, where all the most amazing stories are. And so,
Stephen, I'm going to invite you to segue into the Dominion and the CP Railway. You just have 10 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Yeah. This is my problem. I get so excited about everything that I tend to just go off on a tangent. So I'll quickly go into Dominion. So the Hudson's Bay Company ends. Let's set it aside. It existed, but as a regular trading entity, albeit one with a massive network of entrenched outposts and logistics networks. But I'll just describe the state of Canada at the time of Confederation. Of course, most of the population at that time, Montreal is the only real city in the country at that time. Ottawa was a stinking little backwater of some logging with broken sewer pipes and mud streets anywhere. Kingston, after the Loyalists had gone in, was a small little center, but Canada's only big city was Montreal, and it probably had up to 40,000, 50, 60, 70,000 people. It kept expanding throughout the 19th century rapidly. Those numbers seem tiny to us now, but back then that was a big place. You have the prairies, which were undergoing a period of rapid transformation with the decline of the buffalo, and the fur trade was operating, but most of that entire region was still under the various controls of the indigenous peoples, with the Hudson's Bay Company networks operating there. And on the far coast, you have British Columbia, what began as the fur trade outpost. And then after 1858, in the influx of tens of thousands of American miners from California, when gold was discovered along the Fraser River, had taken on a different character. It was no longer exclusively a fur trade outpost. And that's when this Governor Douglas he basically formed the colony without even having the authority from London to do so, and imposed law and order on these American miners and claimed that they were in this British territory now. So he created this political entity, which only mostly existed in paper and people's imaginations at the time. But Victoria itself was the only outpost of any significance other than fur trade, basically to the west of the settled areas of Ontario and Quebec. And along came this fellow named John A. Macdonald, who famously amalgamated, Upper Canada and Lower Canada and all the Atlantic provinces and created this country called Canada. It was him who took over the Hudson's Bay Company monopoly in 1870, and he wanted to connect it to this British colony on the coast. And the reason he had this massive dream, Canada is essentially Macdonald's dream. We don't really exist if there's no John A. Macdonald. We would all just be, probably all of us, already incorporated into the United States. And then so it was his idea to do this, and he promised the British Columbia that he was going to build this railway out to the coast if they agreed to join him instead of to the United States. And from Victoria, the only way to travel, so the delegates from British Columbia decided they were going to travel to Ottawa and meet and discuss this joining of Canada. And the irony is, in order to do that, they took a steamship down to San Francisco, boarded an American train, rode the continent across the American train, and then came back up into Ottawa to have these meetings. And so there's a bit of an irony there that you want to discuss joining a country, but there's no way to even travel between the two parts of this country. And you have to do it by going through a foreign country, which is the country which already has most of your commerce, and was Governor Douglas who just was, and some of the other Hudson's Bay people saying, no, we have a British heritage. We want to maintain within a political affiliation of Britain rather than the United States, even though most of the people at that time were probably originated in America. And so you have this delegation, and they are promised that they're going to get a railway if they agree to join this new country called Canada. And that's the business plan for Confederation, is the idea that they're going to build this railway. And there's a whole bunch of corruption scandals and swindles, and the Pacific scandal where the votes are being bought by John A. from Sir John Allen in Montreal. Montreal being the only city, that's where the Bank of Montreal was, and that's where the Hudson's Bay Company was headquartered, and that's where the CPR ended up being headquartered. Yeah, the scandals and the corruption. I mean, that's where you really get to the juice of this story. And obviously, we don't have time to talk about all of that, but it's really fascinating. Just because at that time, elections weren't secret ballot; it was open ballot. So you can see the temptation to abuse the system. People would show up and start buying everyone whiskey all afternoon and get them all really drunk on their promise of, well, I bought you the whiskey. You gotta vote for me now. And if you don't, I see that you haven't. And my thugs are gonna go beat you up in the mud, throw you in the alley or something, right? So, elections were a very boisterous time. Could be very violent, and a lot of just so much corruption now that it scratches our head and we think, wow, we think we have it bad. Let's go back then. But anyway, that's the financing of the railroad is just occluded with corruption like that. And it's amazing that it even got built in the first place, though, when you consider the geography. I mean, railroads were starting is a new technology railroad, so only rose in the mid and later 19th century. And after the discovery of dynamite in 1867, all of a sudden you could blast rock to level ground. You could open harbors. You could build roads. So it was this technology of dynamite is what enabled the dreams of steam power, which enabled the political dream of countries like the United States or Canada to expand themselves. Without that technology, your mind wouldn't even go there because it's technically impossible. So what's the point of imagining? But as soon as you had dynamite, you start thinking, oh, we're just going to blast our way through the mountain, or we're going to blast around Lake Superior, no problems. And they thought this railway would just, at the time, of course, it was the most technically sophisticated and longest railroad ever conceived. But they still thought they were going to do it in a certain number of years. Of course, they've grossly underestimated the magnitude of it because they just didn't even have very good geographical knowledge of what the land in between these two outposts. And it ended up taking them a decade to do it and costing the lives of thousands of people. But it completely transformed the country because all of a sudden we had a spine. Let's just call it. The nation had a spine. You could actually travel from one point in it to another point in it, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, with staying within its territory, something which otherwise would have taken a year before and would have involved dog sleds and canoes and hiking and horseback riding or whatever. Like, it was not really a feasible thing. And you can't really have a country if you can't have any kind of commercial transportation network within its own borders. So that is Canada, is created because of the CPR. And in my book on Dominion, I detail all the financial shenanigans, and the political dreamings and the imaginations of it, as well as the conditions of all the workers who really poured their lives into this project. I mean, thousands died doing it. Many others spent the most horrible time of their lives working, but they all had this belief that they were contributing to something big, and it was a big. And the idea of railroads, you see, land has no. This is the business plan of railroads. The land, all this land that no one had ever been to, has no value unless you could get to it. But if you can start blasting the railroad through, every piece of land that the railroad gets to, all of a sudden is worth a lot, because you can start farming, you can start mining, you can get any of the products of anything that anyone does there out to a market for it, and you can get any of the goods and services in to supply the people who are doing the work. And if you can't do that, you don't have an economy and you don't have a market. So as the railway built its way west across the country, it continuously opened up new regions for commerce and created value out of nothing just by virtue of its existence. that was why it was enriching everyone and creating a large demand for labor and creating, farming communities and mining communities as it went across the country. It sort of built the country as it existed and populated the country because people could get in and out all of a sudden, and people commercial dreams could be enacted, and transportation could be enacted, and you could have political solidification and prevented the country from becoming part of the United States. The There was two areas of the railway which were really hard to build. The prairies was easy because most of it is flat, and you build trestle bridges over the river valleys, but that was within the technical capacity of the time, engineering capacity. The area around top of Lake Superior was a huge problem because it's all granite. I mean, the Canadian Shield, and it's all lumpy, and bogs, and that almost bankrupted the country, the company that was building the CPR, because they were just money was literally being poured into the swamps to try and level it out, and they were burning through so much dynamite trying to explode this rock that it was consuming all the fortunes of all the original investors who thought they thought it was going to be, oh, this is great, we're going to get all these government grants and we're going to pocket all this secret government money and slap together a railway and we'll end up rich, right? A way of accessing the public funds for themselves. That proved not to be the case. And the other reason it proved not to be the case was the Rocky Mountains, of course. I mean, for anyone who's ever been to the Rocky Mountains, try to imagine where you could conceivably build a railway. It can't even have the grades of a road. A railway has to be more or less flat. I think it's a 3% grade. Otherwise, the trains don't make it up or down the passes. And so some of these famous passes, like Kicking Horse Pass and Rogers Pass, and the route along the Fraser Canyon, the inland Fraser Canyon. I mean, it took Chinese laborers blasting with dynamite in most dangerous, horrible conditions through British Columbia. Over 600 died in just a couple of years doing that job. Immigrant Chinese workers brought over from China. And the passes, I mean, they were barely open by the time that the railway was even like desperately trying to complete itself before it went bankrupt. And it was so heavily leveraged with government debt and with debt. And the Bank of Montreal was so heavily involved. And all the financiers in Montreal were so leveraged into this project that had it collapsed, it would have taken down the entire financial and banking system of the whole nation and probably would have caused a political collapse as well. And that's one of the great ironies is that MacDonald's his one great nemesis was Louis Riel, and Louis Riel's rebellions and standing up for the rights of his people, one in 1870 and the other in 1885 when the railway was finally completed, kind of bookend the entire CPR project, because when he had his first rebellion, they realized, oh, we can't even get to this territory. It took 3 months for the expeditionary force sent out, from Ottawa to Montreal area to even get there and haul their equipment out there. And of course, they realized, oh, this is not really a feasible thing. This is not really a country. This is not going to be part of our territory anymore. If one person can just have a little uprising and we have no way to even get any people there to put it down. So that's what really sort of gave the political cover for building it in the first place. And then 15 years later, the entire thing was about to collapse, as I had just mentioned. And then along comes Riel again. He was brought up from the United States because during that time he was quite famous in Quebec and had was respected there, but he was hated in Ontario. And so he had effectively been exiled and was unable to take a seat in Parliament, even though he'd been elected there from a Manitoba riding. He was living in exile in the United States, and he was brought back in because it was a very chaotic period of time in the 1880s with the destruction of the buffalo and the starvation on the plains because of that, and railway pounding its way through, and violence in the United States, and there was uprisings again. And so Riel came in to lead another uprising, the famous Northwest Rebellion of 1885, and the leader of the railway, Cornelius Van Corn, in Montreal, went to Ottawa and promised Sir John A. Build that. Get your armies together. I will get you there in less than 2 weeks. out there. And everyone thought, wow, that's amazing, because the railway wasn't complete at the time. There's about literally within a couple of months of complete collapse and bankruptcy. And so he provided, he said, I'll give you free transportation on this railway. And he got the troops on, and I believe he got them there in 12 days. The railway wasn't complete, so they rode on the parts that were complete, got off and hiked over the parts where it wasn't finished around Lake Superior and whatever, but he did get a whole pile of troops out there within a very fast period of time and suppressed that rebellion, and that shifted the attitude in the East to supporting the railway. And the government was able to use I'll be done in 30 seconds. It used that as a political cover to push through yet more grants or more loans to prevent it from going bankrupt. And the whole country was completely leveraged on it. And that allowed it to complete itself. And there we have the famous last spike was brought in. And yeah, there's so many stories on that too. And I just kind of glossed over them a bit. But I mean, these are incredible periods of time. The heroic age of Canada has passed. So many fascinating people.